Radio Network. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined as usual by my co-host, Matt Karoly. Today, we are joined by Bleeding Green Nation's Michael Kist. You can find him on the BGN Radio podcast, writing content for Bleeding Green Nation, covering the Eagles. Welcome to the show, Mike.
It is good to be with you guys, Aaron. It's been a while since we last spoke. You look as handsome as ever. Just want to let you know.
I think what was it before the Falcons Eagles playoff game? Was that the last time?
That's correct. Yeah, we did that. We've done some season previews together. So yeah, we've done quite a bit together. So it's good to be talking with you about some. It's finally here. We finally get some real film to break down. Unfortunately for the Falcons, it's a tough loss, but it's week one. No big deal. Let's not overreact, everyone. I'm telling the Falcons fans that, by the way. Eagles, we overreacted to the first half a little bit as a fan base, so I get it.
So, Mike, I want to start the conversation off tonight with talking about Carson Wentz a little bit. Obviously it's only been one game, but that first game was a good one for him. And I'm curious, what have you seen from him in the early going? And, do you think he's close to that MVP form that he displayed a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of talk about him getting the brace off and everything that was going to help his mobility, being another year removed from the ACL. And I think we saw that a lot in the way that he was able to navigate the pocket and then also break outside of the pocket, make things work outside of structure for him. Also, just the subtle movements in the pocket I felt were better than last year as well. And under pressure, that's when those kind of pop up. And you saw him go like 9 for 10 under pressure with a perfect quarterback rating. So he was really effective in all areas. The deep ball was hitting with Deshaun. Really all he has to do is throw it up in an area and Deshaun's going to run up under it. So there's not rocket science when it comes to that. But overall, I thought he did a good job of getting rid of the ball, letting the offense work for him, take the shots. And then the second Deshaun bomb wasn't audible on his part. It was a coverage that he saw and then changed the route for Deshaun. They ran like a smash divide concept where they had two guys going straight at the free safety, Nicholson. And Nicholson didn't have a chance. He could have gone to Nelly or Deshaun and thrown a touchdown there. So mentally sharp, physically sharp, looking great. We're hoping that continues. We're hoping the health continues, of course.
Now, Mike, I want to ask you a little bit about this week one game. Obviously, the Eagles gave up a bunch of big plays early in that game. Was that a little bit of a surprise to you that the Redskins were able to attack their defense down the field? Or is that something that you feel could potentially be a problem area for the Eagles throughout the season?
A little column A, a little column B, because all week and really in the offseason too, we do a series called Eye on the Enemy where we were looking at the Washington Redskins and I'm thinking, where is this team threatening you vertically? And the only chance was really that we talked about at the time was Terry McLaurin be something that we don't know if he was or not. We know he had speed. We didn't know he had like that kind of deep speed and was going to be featured that early in the offense. And Case Keenum isn't exactly known as a big time deep ball thrower. So yeah, that was definitely surprising. I think what hurt the Eagles and what makes me concerned for it moving forward is the fact that on one of those bombs, it was Rasul Douglas in coverage, and Rasul Douglas is a press corner. He's a long guy and he doesn't have real great speed. You put him in press, but then you put him in bail and he has to half turn and run with Terry McLaurin and you've got a blitz coming. He's got no safety help. That's not the best way to put your players in a position to succeed. I mean, there were other times on a 3rd and 5 they had a conversion. Rasul Douglas was the only one off. He was like 8 yards off. Everyone else is pressing. Those other guys aren't press corners, but they were pressing. And Rasul Douglas is 10 yards. Like I didn't understand the logic of the way that he was deploying his cornerback. So yeah, that's definitely concerning. And he does some weird stuff with bringing his safeties down into the box. And on that touchdown to McLaurin too, I mean, they made it obvious to Keenum that number one, they were coming with a blitz. Number two, there was going to be a safety over top. And you're telling, Keenum pre-snap, if you can make one move in the pocket and let this develop, you've got McLaurin on Douglas. And that is a win 100 times out of 100. And they almost got him again later on with Sidney Jones. They were trying to squat the intermediate stuff with the blitz coming and they were just able to burn them. So it's a combination of the blitzes not getting home that they were burned on. They were burned on play action bad. It's something like 15 yards per attempt, if I'm not mistaken. I actually have the number right here. Yeah, 15.3 yards per attempt off play action. And the looks that they blitzed against, one of them was 2nd and 8. Heavy, like run formation type look with reduced splits, was a formation that Schwartz likes to blitz against the Falcons historically. So that kind of gives me pause because it feels like, okay, if they do that again, the Falcons are definitely going to try to take advantage of that and possibly burn them. Now, Schwartz, for some reason, comes out with a really inexplicable game plan one week, and the next week he's fantastic, and he's been very good against the Falcons. I have no idea what to expect from the defense next week.
So Aaron and I have made no secrets on our show here that we're extremely bullish on the Eagles. We've even went as far as saying, we think they're going to be NFC representative in the Super Bowl. On paper, they have very few weaknesses. I know you kind of touched on some things that have you concerned a little bit, but are there any other areas or what's the biggest weakness in your eyes, Mike, as far as this Eagles roster and that could potentially be exploited maybe by the Falcons or just in general going forward?
Yeah, I think one of the issues was trying to figure out how to dole out the targets and the looks to guys, because there's so many different weapons and there's so many different directions that this offense can go. And in the beginning, they tried some weird stuff with 21 personnel that didn't exactly work. And I don't think the fan base has the full trust in offensive coordinator Mike Groh, since we trust Doug Peterson, obviously, but since, DeFilippo leaves and then also Frank Reich leaves, there's the concern of brain drain. Peterson's going to be good. He's got a lot of stuff to do. He needs those guys channeling that information up to him, filtering what he should hear and implement into the game plan. And that's something that's concerning. So dialing up those shot plays were a concern coming into the game, less of a concern now. But I think overall, just finding an identity for this team was a struggle in week one. Finding rhythm in the run game was also a struggle. It was really up and down when it hit. It was great. First half, it was not working at all. And I think they were getting a little too cute for themselves in the first half. So I think they can overthink themselves a little bit. They just need to let the matchups work for them. So I would just say consistency on the offensive side of the ball, find the identity and stick to it and run with it would be a concern that they won't do that. They'll get away with it and get too cute.
Well, the Falcons are coming off a week where they really struggled to protect Matt Ryan. And, right now on this show, we're going to look for any silver linings that we can get in this upcoming matchup. I'm curious, do you feel like the season-ending injury to Malik Jackson could significantly hurt this Eagles pass rush? Or do you believe that the Eagles have enough pieces with guys like a healthy Tim Jernigan and some of the other young pass rushers coming up that they can potentially fill that void for Malik Jackson?
I would be lying to you if I said that I wasn't concerned. I mean, Malik Jackson week one had one of the best pass rush win rates. I think he was top 10 for interior defensive lineman or defensive lineman, something like that. So having him out definitely hurts. The Eagles are super deep on the interior. I mean, to the point where they were trading away guys that were quality players in the preseason for them and had good futures. Trayvon Hester was one of them, was a contributor for the team last year. They ended up trading him away. The Hassan Ridgeway, who they traded for in the draft, who's 24 years old, looks fantastic. Timmy Jernigan looks to health. And I think that was part of the reason they signed Malik Jackson, because they weren't sure at that time of the year if Timmy Jernigan was going to be a healthy guy. He looks fully back, which is nice. However, the pass rush did not hit. And I don't know what PFF is charting, but PFF credited the Eagles with a 42.5% pressure rate on Keenum. I didn't see that whatsoever in the game. And so I don't know what was going on there, but the edges weren't getting pressure. They were double chipping a lot. The Washington was, so maybe that was part of the issue there. But Derek Barnett had a bad game. Brandon Graham really didn't get home, but he was fantastic against the run. Fletcher Cox had an up and down game, which is unusual for him. And then of course, now we're dealing with less depth along that defensive interior. And you saw late in the game, they weren't really getting pressure as the Washington offense just marched down the field. So yeah, I think definitely pass rush is a concern, especially against the looks that the Falcons will give them.
So, Mike, we're going to get out of here pretty quickly. I'm curious, are you confident that this sort of matchup will go sort of the same way that it has gone the last couple of times the Falcons have faced the Eagles? Or do you feel like there are some, chinks in the armor, so to speak, and maybe, fourth time's a charm with the Falcons in these last couple of years? Maybe they'll finally have learned some lessons and maybe be able to exploit this upcoming week.
I mean, really, when you say it went a certain way, like a ball bounces a different way in any three of those games. You know what I mean? They played themselves so tightly between the two over the last 3 years. So I have no delusions that like the Eagles have their number. Although like I said, Schwartz has done a good job of, making sure that Julio doesn't completely wreck the game for them, because that's happened to them before with receivers like Calvin Johnson in the past and whatnot. But look, I think it's going to be a tight game. I don't think anybody has anybody figured out. So I think that the Falcons are more than capable, despite their week one stumble. We saw it last year with them. They struggled with the Eagles week one, especially in the red zone. I think a lot of those issues are kind of in the back seat now. So I do expect the Falcons to give them a serious test. If the Eagles can't figure out their defensive issues and they're going to have to end up in a boat race, then anything can happen. Any big play can turn it. So if I'm betting, I'm staying away from this game. There's no way I'm putting money on this, to be honest with you.
Do you have a matchup or two, Mike, that you're keen in on for this one that you think could decide this ball game?
Who do you think would be on Deshaun Jackson? It wouldn't be Isaiah Oliver, right? He's more the longer or
Yeah, I hope not. If he is, that's a major problem because Thielen ate him up this past week. That's the major question I got.
Yeah, he struggled, man. And look, Deshaun, I was wondering if they were going to travel Josh Norman with Alshon Jeffrey. They kind of did, but the Eagles set it up to where they would have trips formations and they would threaten vertically from the slot with Deshaun, who ran 48% of his routes from the slot and averaged almost 8 yards per route run from the slot. So the Falcons need to find a way to match up with that and make sure that their safeties don't end up like backpedaling while Deshaun is in cruise control going down the Autobahn. Right. You know what I mean? So I think that's the big thing for me. I'm very interested to see they'll move Deshaun early on in the first drive. And that's the matchup that I kind of want to see how the Falcons, deal with that and deal with it vertically too.
They did travel Trufant with Diggs last week, and so I think that's probably what this like. If they did it with the Vikings receivers, I think they'll do it again with the Eagles receivers. Just because you have Oliver and his length makes most sense for get him on Jeffrey as much as possible.
Right, I agree.
And then Trufant with his speed, he's the only real corner that the Falcons really have at this point in time. And Kendall Sheffield's got the speed, but you don't want to necessarily put him out there against Deshaun Jackson in his real first NFL game. So I think Trufant's going to be the guy that you're going to have, covering Deshaun Jackson, and then, hopefully it'll work out a little bit better than it did for Oliver last week. And Trufant played really well against Diggs. I think he only gave it one reception this past week. So, hopefully that can sort of nix that Deshaun Jackson vertical pass and take that out of the game, because certainly you don't want that to be a big element in this upcoming matchup.
I mean, that sparked the offense for the Eagles. If they didn't have Deshaun Jackson for this game, and look, I have a lot of trust in Doug Peterson. I have a lot of trust in Carson Wentz. Someone's got to throw it. Someone's got to scheme it up. Deshaun Jackson was the spark that offense needed. If he wasn't there for that game, I think they probably managed to lose it to Washington, which is bad because Washington is bad in literally every part of football. The organization, the PR, the field is bad. Like all of it's bad. So that would be pretty embarrassing.
Yeah. So, Matt, you got any other more questions for Mike? Or
no, I think we're good. Mike, appreciate your time, man. Thanks for all the great insight.
Yeah, Absolutely. Mike, go ahead, plug what you got coming up on Bleeding Green and elsewhere.
Yeah, we got a ton of film stuff up on bleedinggreennation.com that we just dropped. Bleeding Green Nation, if you put that into any podcast app, it'll come up. We just dropped our film review of the game against the Washington Redskins. So if you want to check that out and learn more about the enemy, feel free, come on over. Hopefully you'll stick around a little bit more. So we appreciate it, allowing you to give us this platform, and I appreciate you guys having me on. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get another opportunity to do it again, maybe in the playoffs.
Hey, I'm here for it. Maybe another play in the corner of the end zone.
Hopefully it goes the other way.
Yeah.
Maybe Julio won't fall. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Love you guys. Sorry about that.
All good, man. Appreciate it again.
We could take it.
We've been through worse, right?
Yeah. So, guys, that was Michael Kist. Check him out on Bleeding Green. Great analysis. Great follow on Twitter, Michael Kist NFL.
Yep.
KIST. So he does a lot of NFL stuff in addition to the Eagle stuff. So definitely should be a follow for you guys.
And some draft coverage too. I think is a good reason to follow him as well. Not just the Eagles stuff, but he does some good draft coverage throughout the year and whatnot. So
we're going to keep this show going. We'll sort of talk a little bit about the Julio deal. We'll talk a little bit about some of the roster moves the Falcons have made since last week's show. We'll get into the Vikings sort of game. We're not going to spend a ton of time sort of talking about the game in general. We got a couple of film plays that we want to break down, one for the offense, one for the defense. And you can probably guess them. They're not good for either side of the ball. And so for us, it kind of represents some of like a microcosm of some of the big issues that were plaguing the Falcons. And we'll sort of discuss what we thought were some of the big thoughts, and then we'll sort of get into this Eagles game. And unlike before, where we usually fish for mailbag questions on Twitter and elsewhere, and you guys can send those in beforehand, instead we want you guys to get in the YouTube chat and ask your questions. And so, any questions that you ask now, we will try to get to later in the show. We will try to mix them in throughout the show if we can, but we got some premium content coming up, so we want to focus on that at first. But definitely when we get later in the show, we will, as you guys send in your questions, in the YouTube chat, then we will answer them as they come. So let's get into this Julio Jones contract. This was much discussed between Matt and I over the last, I don't know, 6 months, it seems like, since we've been waiting for this move to happen. When the first reports back in March were saying, oh, it's imminent, and we're like, oh, speculating on what the contract will wind up being. We found out, the general terms of the deal. We haven't got the exact breakdown of how it goes, but it's a 3-year extension for $66 million with $64 million guaranteed at signing. That surpasses, I think, the most guaranteed money of any wide receiver. I think maybe Beckham got 65, but not at signing.
Yeah, in total.
Yeah. So
might have him beat still, but
I think Beckham got 41 million or roughly at
close to
signing.
41 at signing.
So basically, that guaranteed money pretty much locks Julio Jones in for at least the next 3 years. Again, I'm assuming based off of the terms that the next 3 years of Julio's contract are guaranteed, which would take him to his age 32 season, which, is usually a point where most wide receivers take a decline, but a decline for Julio Jones is still probably better than, let's say, 87% of the wide receivers in the NFL. So we'll just have to sort of see how that goes. But Matt, we talked about this last week in terms of, and you asked me, and I was like, I don't think it's going to happen. But you asked about whether or not we would see Julio Jones break that $20 million barrier and push into the $22, $23 million range to make him one of the highest paid non-quarterbacks in the league, alongside guys like Aaron Donald. And that kind of happened. So, take your victory lap, Matt, I guess. But what were your thoughts when you saw the terms of those contracts?
Yeah, I was just, ecstatic for Julio. Being that it was almost a fully guaranteed contract, which, the only such deal we've seen is Kirk Cousins' deal, 3 years, $84 million with the Vikings. So it was close enough to that point where, again, Julio, probably an outlier, again, kind of in that Aaron Donald vein. I don't know if this is going to change the landscape of contracts and more players are going to receive, fully guaranteed contracts like you have in the NBA and MLB and all that. Again, Julio's the type of guy that's deserving of this, being that the type of teammate he is, person, player, all that. So I was happy to see it happen. I thought, like you said on last week's show, I thought that could be what's holding it up, is that it was going to exceed what the market was by a couple million, which, the 22 million a year average kind of did that, which, past Michael Thomas's $19.5 million a year average. Again, like you also mentioned, we're still waiting on the structure. I think, at the very least, like you said, guarantees him for the next 3 years. I think 4 years is what it's going to happen. What's going to boil down to. It's going to lock him up for the next 4 years, which again, runs concurrent with Calvin Ridley's deal. Assuming that they pick up the 5th-year option, which is probably a formality. So at that point, then, we'll see what they do if Julio's still playing at a level like Terrell Owens, say, was playing in his mid-30s, which, I like to use as the comp for what we can maybe potentially expect from Julio in his twilight years. Then, they can restructure and, again, work more on a year-to-year basis with him. Obviously restructuring Calvin's deal could lower the cap hit for his, extension in the first couple of years, and it wouldn't make it so top heavy as far as receiver contracts go. If again, you're going to maintain Julio on your books into his 34 and 35-year season. But yeah, for me, it's the one bit of positive news Falcons fans got this weekend with the contract. You and I really didn't think there was ever a doubt. It was always going to come to Saturday being the deadline. And that's what it ended up being. And, happy to have Julio in the fold and not have this as a distraction or a dark cloud hanging over their head any longer.
Yeah. And not to necessarily plug other podcasts while I'm on another podcast, but I got to talk with the Athletics' Jeff Schultz on Locked On Falcons, the other podcast that I do. And one of the interesting things that Jeff said, you guys, you should check out the full episode, obviously.
Not to cut you off, but I don't check out many of them. I do on occasion, and that was one I did check out. Good interview, worth time. But I'm sure Aaron's going to plug more, so go on. But yeah, definitely check that out over at Locked On Falcons.
And I thought one of the interesting tidbits that Jeff said was sort of that the holdup was Jimmy Sexton, Julio's agent, basically was from the start planning to take it down to the wire to try to milk the maximum amount of money out of the Falcons. And so apparently the way that sort of Jeff implied is the Falcons kind of knew that going into it. And that's one of the reasons why they weren't necessarily panicking about, the whole drama around whether Julio was going to play or suit up week one, or whether the deal would get done before week one. But it is interesting that, maybe that it wasn't necessarily because it was a back and forth negotiation that they were haggling over a certain price point. But it was just simply the agent deciding, we'll just get this done. We'll wait till, September 7th or September 6th to get a deal done. And that's the reason why it didn't happen in August like we thought, or July like we thought, or and according to some reports in March, like some people were out there suggesting. So definitely check it out and get Jeff's thoughts on that. But obviously the deal is done. We'll sort of have to see what the exact structure is, and we'll probably wind up talking about it on a future episode when we get that information. And I'll be curious to sort of see what the next 3 or 4 years of Julio's career is going to be like, because Matt and I sort of differ on Julio's long-term longevity. I have questions about that, but it's one of those things where I just wonder a little bit if all these sort of nagging injuries that Julio tends to deal with and has dealt with over the last couple of years, whether those would be a little bit more problematic, at age 31, 32 than they have been at age 28, 29. So I do wonder if, he's going to be that type of TO type of player that's going to play till he's 35 and 36, like a Larry Fitzgerald or someone like that. So it'll be interesting to sort of see where Julio is like 3 years from now, if he's, still doing Julio things.
I mean, just to add to that, I think this load management, which has become a popular thing for athletes to take part in, LeBron James, I think, has made it the most popular, in the NBA with managing his minutes, managing his time so that he can, when he's out there, he's the most efficient. I know Julio, other than the touchdown jokes that people like to make, I think some people like to give him grief that he's not on the field every play, but I think this is all done with the purpose of, again, prolonging his shelf life, prolonging his effectiveness. And I think, again, it's something we saw in week one, whether there was, again, because that was a rumor that there was an injury and that would potentially hold him out and not necessarily the contract thing. But I think we've seen it over the last couple of years. I think we're going to continue to see it where Julio's not playing 100% of the snaps like you see a DeAndre Hopkins do or an Odell Beckham do. But again, when he's out there, he's as effective and as efficient as ever, just based purely on that yards per route run stat that Pro Football Focus likes to chart, which, again, measures a wide receiver's efficiency probably better than any other metric. He's been tops in the league the last 4 years. I think that's going to be how they manage this is again, limiting his snaps, not putting him out there like he did when he was first in the league. And that's why I'm confident that I think he can be like a Terrell Owens and can play in his 30s, mid 30s, and like a Larry Fitzgerald, creeping in that 35, 36. So I think that's just going to be one of the drawbacks is, again, you're not going to see Julio on the field every play. But for the long run, I think that strategy would pay off. I mean, that's been my thought on why they do that and, what the long-term benefits would be.
Yeah, hopefully, I hope it works out. And we'll just have to sort of see.
Because, I mean, he's had the nagging injuries, but it hasn't kept him out of games since when? 2016 was the last time he missed the game. So that's 2 seasons now where he's played a full 16-game slate and has been the top receiver.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's going to be an issue anytime soon. It's just, just like 3-4 years from now, that's where it's a concern for me. So I think, the thing I will say about this contract is I like the fact that the Falcons, if it's basically locking in Julio Jones through his 32 season, and there's no sort of guaranteed money in his age 33 or whatever season, that if this becomes an issue, and I want to stress the word if, not saying when, if this becomes an issue, the Falcons have the flexibility to say, okay, Julio's for whatever reason, the bunion has gotten out of control or whatever the case may be in 2022 or whatever. And, it's time to turn the keys over to Calvin Ridley, and maybe we can take this, 15 million or whatever it is, and maybe, get not, at that point in time, maybe not as we can get like 70% of a declining Julio Jones for half the price or something like that. So it gives them that flexibility. I'm not suggesting that that's what the Falcons should do or anything like that. But I like the contract because I think the Falcons kind of screwed themselves with the Roddy contract, giving him a big deal when he was like 31 or something like that. And it kind of locked them in to a couple seasons of Roddy beyond when he was still good. And they couldn't really get out of it. And, so I think this is a good move on the Falcons' part. And obviously it's a great move on Julio Jones's part because he's going to get a lot of money over the next 3 years. And that's money that he deserves. So we'll just have to see how it all shakes out long term. So on the roster front, the Falcons wound up placing Chris Lindstrom on injured reserve. He broke his foot in week 1 about midway through the game. We'll sort of see if he's back in 8 weeks. He'll be out for at least a minimum of 8 weeks with the short-term IR where you don't necessarily have to declare players anymore. I believe the rules are now you can just put anybody in IR and, if they are able to come back, they can come back.
And it is 8 weeks, correct? It's not 8 games because I had a little confusion about that when I was looking it up.
I think it is 8 games. That's what
I thought too with Deion Jones, but based on the AtlantaFalcons.com reporting, and again maybe they're off, and based on what I've seen, just quick Google searching it, it always stresses 8 weeks. It doesn't say 8 games, but again that was my understanding too as well, that it was games. Which again, if that's the case, it would be week 11 since the bye week falls during that time, and it would be the Carolina game. But what's been reported is the earliest he can come back is week 10 against New Orleans.
Okay. I thought it was 8 games. When you tweeted that, I thought you were correct. So I didn't.
Okay. Well, I issued a correction tweet because I thought I was wrong. So might have to amend that as well.
Don't put it on me. I don't know. So,
okay. All right.
I thought you were correct in the initial tweet. So basically 2 months.
I guess keep that in the back of your head, fans. It might be 8 games.
Yeah. So we'll have to sort of see how he responds to the surgery that he's going to wind up having and his recovery and whatnot. There's no like we saw with Deion Jones, we were all chomping at the bit for him to come back after 8 weeks or 8 games or whatever the number was. And it was
more like 10 or 11.
Yeah, I think it was like 11. I think so.
Yeah.
To fill the roster spot, the Falcons went out and got John Wetzel, everybody's favorite ex-Cardinals utility offensive lineman. And, Wetzel was okay in the preseason, I thought, early on. Then he got a little nicked up, and then he was bad for the last couple of games. And
yeah, I mean, if he sees time on the field, something went horribly wrong. Pretty much. Because this signing is just to fill out the 53-man roster. He's going to be a game day inactive. We're going to continue to have Wes Schweitzer as the interior offensive line backup. We're going to either have Matt Gano if his back's okay, possibly being the swing tackle with McGarry. And if he's not healthy, then we're going to see another dose of the Sembrilo and McGarry rotation, it looks like, for another week, which we'll get to a little bit later, I think. Wasn't great, but we kind of expected that with who they were facing. Danielle Hunter, he did Danielle Hunter things on Sunday. Pro Football Focus credited him with 10 pressures. That was kind of split evenly amongst McGarry and Sembrilo, although it should be noted Sembrilo had 10 less snaps, so his performance looks a little worse when you factor that in. But yeah, this is tough. Lindstrom, had a pretty solid debut, I'd say. Again, according to Pro Football Focus, he was the only offensive lineman that didn't get credited with a pressure given up. The run game didn't get going, so I wasn't spending a particular close time looking at his run blocking. But again, I was pretty satisfied with what I saw, and it's unfortunate that this kind of sets him back. One of the worst things for a rookie is getting hurt because it stunts your development. And I guess the one saving grace is Lindstrom's kind of one of those. I'm not saying he's a ready-made player, but he came in polished So again, you just wanted to get him as many reps as possible, especially against the top level competition like he was going up against with Minnesota, and he would have gone to get up against this week against Philadelphia. So, I'm not too concerned about what this does for his development because, again, I do think he was a ready-made player, which is the reason why the coaching staff gave him the right guard job pretty much on day one. But again, it's unfortunate because he really kind of was the guy that allowed this offensive line to have the type of potential that I think it had coming into the season. And, while, again, I've been a big Jamon Brown supporter, on this show, and I'm excited to see him, hopefully earn his money now as a starting right guard. Lindstrom's clearly the better player, and the potential isn't quite there with Jamon Brown. But it's still, I went right off this unit. I still think, again, they brought in Brown with the intention of potentially being the starting right guard if they weren't able to get a guy like Chris Lindstrom in the draft. So that's why we can't overreact. But again, it's unfortunate, and hopefully Lindstrom can recover and return as soon as possible and get back in there, and hopefully make a push for the playoffs if we're at that point.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think the ceiling goes down for this offensive line.
Yeah.
And without Lindstrom, and sort of seeing what sort of heights he could reach during the course of this rookie season, and maybe he gets back and comes back strong in the second half of the season. That's still a possibility. So it doesn't completely close the door on that, but it is one of those things that at least for the next 8 games, not necessarily expecting this offensive line to play some great football in terms of being this sort of completely revamped unit that we were hoping that we would potentially be able to see. And I think guys like Carpenter and Brown are certainly serviceable to solid starters. We're hoping that McGarry can continue to grow and sort of turn into that as well. We know Mac is one of the better centers in the league. Jake Matthews didn't look like it on Sunday against the Vikings, but Everson Griffin has a history of having his number in it. I would argue that if you compare Matthews' performance this past week against his previous performance against Everson Griffin, this past week was an improvement. So if you're looking for some positivity there, he was like 12% better than he was the last time. So, that's a testament, I think, a little bit to Jake Matthews. And obviously, he got beat a number of times in some one-on-one blocks, which spin moves, Dwight Freeney rode spin moves to the Hall of Fame. They're really hard to defend. Anybody that watched the great Brooks Reed knows they're difficult to defend. So I can't get too mad at Jake for getting beat by a spin move, but some of the other mistakes that he made in the game were a little bit more problematic. But you look at this offensive line, and you're basically just hoping for serviceability and solid play, I guess. On a 10-point scale, you're hoping for like a 6. When I think before the ceiling potentially was like an 8 or a 9 if McGarry and Lindstrom were able to click early, or at least over the course of the season, you could build to that. So we'll have to continue to monitor this group and see how these guys perform. But having 2 veterans, it makes go ahead.
I'm sorry. How do you rate this unit with now Carpenter and Brown being the left guard and right guard respectively against last year's unit, starting out with Andy Levitri and Brandon Fusco at those spots? I mean, I know you were a big fan of Levitri. You always talk about the second level blocks in the run game, and that's always what gets the run game going. So kind of feel like I know where you'd lean, but I'm curious if maybe.
I mean, if we're not factoring the right tackle position, we're not factoring Ryan Schrader versus whoever we have now, or are we just talking about the interior?
Well, yeah, because again, I would ask that you'd include the information that Ryan Schrader kind of regressed big time and take that all under consideration, how he played last season. So I feel like it's kind of a wash when Schrader, again, it's pretty bad. And right now we're starting kind of on the ground floor with McGarry a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think if you're looking at all 5 guys, you would say.
I'm just curious about the guards, since that was where the most investment was spent this offseason. And now that investment, it has now come to the forefront because they're the 2 starters.
Yeah, I think you nailed it in terms of, at least we'll sort of see if that changes this year. But generally speaking, when you have good guards that can run block on the second level, whether it was Levitri, whether it was Chester, whether it was Ben Garland last year. Schweitzer improved in that regard last season. It tends to make the running game go a lot more just because it opens up those second level cutback lanes for guys like Ito Smith and Tevin Coleman and of course Devontae Freeman to utilize. And that's not really where Carpenter and Brown win. And that was potentially an area where you were hoping that we would see more from Lindstrom, and that was an area that he was pretty good at Boston College when he got those opportunities. So that was one of the hopes. That's what I mean when I say like I don't know if their ceiling is as high, particularly in the running game. But maybe as far as the pass protection goes, I think we could probably say it's probably a wash. Or maybe a slight upgrade, because you can maybe argue that Carpenter's better than any of those guards that we had, Fusco and Levitri in pass protection, at least Levitri at that point in time in his career. So maybe it's better, but I don't know if we're going to, I might be eating those words.
Not noticeable, right? Or not, it's marginal, if anything, maybe.
Yeah, and we're playing Philadelphia, so I might be eating those words. But we'll just have to sort of see how that goes. On the other injury front, we mentioned Matt Gano, and I do think that's maybe one of the reasons why the Falcons signed Wetzel, just because he has that tackle experience, and maybe that's an indicator that maybe Gano's not quite ready to come back this week, but we'll see when the practice report comes out tomorrow. And Russell Gage is in the concussion protocol. Generally speaking, guys don't come back the immediate week after that, and that is a concern. Gage's impact on special teams, which certainly can't, you can't get worse than what we saw last week on the punt team. And obviously we talked about this with Julio, and sort of being on that pitch count. Gage was the guy that got a lot of those opportunities to help keep Julio rested. But if Julio comes out and drops 150 yards on the Eagles, I don't think we're going to be too worried about Julio being on pitch count. But that is something to keep an eye on if Gage is held out of this game week 2.
Yep.
Okay, guys. Any other thoughts, Matt, before we jump into the film review?
Not really. Just preface by saying with this Minnesota game, this is one of those tapes that you just want to burn. Before we do so, we're going to get into a couple plays. But yeah, I mean, all three facets obviously were pretty terrible. Starting off with the offense, not picking up Barr on the sack, starting off with a sack, then having the block punt, and then defense not being able to stop the run, which again we're going to get to here now shortly. But you kind of just have to remove it from the memory bank. I tweeted today. I think on paper, obviously the Eagles have pretty much every advantage over the Falcons, but the Falcons are entering must-win territory. They're the more desperate team. They need this game. So, I'm curious to see how they come out. Are they going to come out starting fast? Because that, I think, is the key to this ball game. If they get out to another slow start, they could be in for another long one. So, yeah, we're going to get into, the first touchdown or second touchdown. It was a Dalvin Cook 19-yard touchdown run here. And kind of the first thing we want to highlight, the edge defenders all game didn't do a good job setting the run. You'll see here we stopped it. I don't know if that's a tackle or a tight end, but gets the outside shoulder of Claiborne. So again, right there, he kind of already lost the rep. You can see at the second level here, Keanu Neal kind of right behind him too, kind of loses the leverage game as well. And you can kind of see the Minnesota Vikings kind of creating that wall, creating that seam for Dalvin Cook. And once he hits it and gets downhill,
you can see it better from the second angle that we're going to show right here.
So right here.
This is Claiborne right here. This is what Matt's talking about.
He's obviously 22. Neal is right behind him. So those two, didn't do a good job winning the leverage game, winning the edge. You can see right there.
Sorry about that. These are the technical difficulties of NFL Game Pass.
Yes.
All right, hold on 1 second. We'll get it back. Okay. All right.
Roll it again. So right there again. And then he even got a deuce block almost, Claiborne did, to really just seal him off. And then, Keanu Neal already doesn't have the proper angle. And the other thing, and I know I've seen other people kind of mention this, Keanu, whether it's not trusting that knee still and not really, going full go of it, kind of did look like a step slower than what we're accustomed to seeing. Now, again, he lost the leverage game. He lost the angle. I don't think he was going to get to him regardless, but, Cook almost even ran away from him at times, which is not something that we would expect. But again, coming off the ACL, it probably should be a little expected. So that was the first two things that, went wrong on that play. The other thing we kind of want to highlight was Damontae Kazee, who, again, you can see Aaron just circled him there, is to the right of Neal. He kind of gets, confused. There's a slight misdirection. Most of the play is flowing to the left, but you will see BB12, the slot receiver, slightly does come across the opposite way right there. He's kind of engaging Keanu Neal. And I think, obviously they're in man-to-man coverage. Kazee's assignment was BB. So when Aaron hits play again, you'll see Kazee goes the opposite direction of the play because he's going to follow BB in front of him a little bit. But at that point, that's kind of really what left Isaiah Oliver then on the island where, again, his man, you can see Oliver on the corner of the screen there. His man was Thielen in coverage. So originally, when this play first started, he thinks he's covering Thielen.
You can see it better from this angle.
Yeah, you can kind of see it better from this angle.
Here's Oliver.
Oliver's the one coming in motion with Thielen. He's covering him, and at that point, it's like, all right, he didn't really get his head around to the left to see where the ball is. So again, there's a little blame to be placed on him, but really, I think Kazee, vacating that area of the field by getting confused by BB's misdirection is kind of really more to blame than Isaiah Oliver taking on that block and not really making a better effort in the run game. So that's kind of what we saw from it. Again, to start throughout the game, not great from the edge defenders in run support, setting an edge. And again, it's something to talk about as far as, Adrian Claiborne's never really been a stand-up edge rusher. So at this late, in his career, the learning curve could be steep. But again, needs to do a better job. And then also Keanu Neal backing him up needs to do a better job winning the leverage, winning the angle battle. And again, that was a common theme throughout the day in the run game and why Minnesota had 5 runs of 17 plus yards through 2 quarters. So,
yeah. And a lot of people, the last thought I'll add about Oliver, a lot of people sort of talking about Oliver and misplaying his play. His job at this point, when he realizes, oh crap, it's a running play, not a pass, because he's in man coverage and following Adam Thielen, he realizes, oh crap, it's a running play, and his job is to basically prevent Cook from getting outside. So he actually kind of plays it correctly. Like if you're going to get mad at anybody, it's really going to be Claiborne setting that soft edge and preventing guys like Deion Jones from being able to pursue to the edge, and then Kazee basically completely vacating it because he too is playing it a pass, but doesn't realize that BB is blocking and instead of running a route and completely vacates his area. So yeah, that was, the Falcons defense in a nutshell. Guys not doing their assignments, guys apparently, being confused. And that to us was sort of a microcosm of some of the issues that the Falcons had on defense. So now, I want to highlight an offensive play. This is the Russell Gage reverse play. And, what the Falcons will do, they're going to motion Hooper, and that's going to try to dictate what the coverage is. And because no one follows him, the Falcons are going to think that the Vikings are in man. And with this safety rotating back, I think that's Anthony Harris.
In zone, zone, you mean, right? You think they're in zone?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, zone.
Yep.
They're going to rotate Anthony Harris back to the deep half, and that's going to dictate a cover 3 look. And so in a cover 3, you'll have this cornerback basically playing this zone, and you might have this linebacker, Ben Gideon, playing in the soft flat. So when the Falcons run their reverse and they'll, pitch it to Ito, and then he'll give it to Gage, and then what will happen is Keith Smith will break this way and then break back out to the outside. So because of the expectation that this is going to be cover 3, the Falcons are thinking we're going to get a one-on-one block. Keith Smith will get whoever the corner or the outside defender. Gage should be able to beat this linebacker to the edge. And essentially the only thing that's going to stop this play from being a big gain is Anthony Harris, this safety, making the play. So the Falcons draw up a pretty good play and they get the look that they want to get. And so when I'm about to run it, you're going to realize that the Vikings aren't in zone coverage and they're actually playing man coverage on this play. And it basically, what happens is several defenders realize, and the main thing, and you'll see it better from this angle, the linebacker, Ben Gideon, this angle, he's tracking Keith Smith. So the minute Keith Smith cuts back to the right side, of course, I knew that was going to happen. Hold on. Sorry, guys. These are the trials and tribulations of Game Pass. So where were we? Okay, let's run it. And so once Keith Smith breaks back, right? Now Keith Smith's about to break back to the right, and Ben Gideon's going to follow him. This linebacker is going to follow Keith Smith.
Now look at what I want to highlight too is look at Daniil Hunter on 80, Luke Stocker blowing up that block. And then you'll see how that affects Keith Smith too. Coming out, he gets tripped up there, so Keith Smith can't even get out to his block.
And so what this play should have been is this linebacker should have been somewhere over here. This corner should have been all the way across the other field because he's playing zone. But because they're playing man, he's tracking Russell Gage. He's followed him all the way from the opposite side of the field. So what it should be is this corner here. And Keith Smith should get this block, and then that would leave green, pastures for Russell Gage. At least the design of this play for the beat the safety. So that should be a big gain on the first down. But of course, because the Vikings disguised their coverage, and then even if they didn't disguise the coverage, maybe the Falcons would have standed a chance to get a better gain on this play if Luke Stocker doesn't get it completely obliterated by Daniil Hunter, and then watch again. It's ugly. And then that takes out Keith Smith. He can't get to his assignment.
Special.
Yeah, so the play was pretty much dead from the start. Once the Vikings, sort of switched to the man coverage, and then Stocker completely blew his block. So it led to a loss of -1, and maybe had they gotten better execution, particularly at this block at the point of attack, maybe they could have gotten at least a decent gain and not put the Falcons behind the chains on that particular series. And the reason we highlight it is it's just a testament to the discipline of the Vikings defense and, completely sniffing out that play from the start. And, also the sort of schematic issues of them disguising a lot of their coverage. That was one of the things that they would do, is that they would show cover 1 a look, and the Falcons like, okay, we got the cover 1, we're going to get Julio. And then they would sort of switch back and have like Harrison Smith drop back, and they'll do a cover 2 look. And then that would completely negate the route that they were looking for. And often those were plays where Matt Ryan would either check it down or scramble. And, then on the other end, it's the Falcons' lack of execution up front. And also a testament to Daniil Hunter, murking other human beings like his doctor. So,
and I'm glad you used that term execution, because, that kind of brings me to one of the other overarching topics I want to talk about. Obviously the Vikings, they were on their details. They executed. Falcons, as we highlighted in that run play, not so much. And that's kind of been a theme. I mean, we didn't touch on too much of the offense, the offensive issues, but when Steve Sarkisian was here, that was something that I highlighted and pointed out, was it's not necessarily the coaching, it's the guys on the field not executing the game plan, not showing attention to detail. And now, again, it's a small sample size with the new coaches, but after week 1, those same issues have surfaced. And, I ask you, Aaron, is this a Dan Quinn problem? Is this something that he's not, focused enough as far as a head coach, as a leader of this football team? I mean, he's big on the culture. He's big on, letting the players play and relying on the talent. But as far as, is he giving the guys too much freedom? Like, Tack McKinley, one of the run plays, kind of showing a reckless abandon in the run game, setting the edge, not doing his job. Is there a bigger problem at hand with this team that's holding them back?
Yeah, I mean, without going on for 20 minutes, sort of going down the litany of issues, like it reminds me a little bit of that Browns game last year where we had Devondre Campbell come out and say like, they weren't necessarily prepared for that. And at least you can argue that they had a little bit of an excuse that week just because there was a new coaching staff and they didn't really know exactly what the, Freddie Kitchens and Greg Williams were going to throw at them. And they did throw some new interesting wrinkles at them that week. And that really caught the Falcons defense in particular off guard, with that sort of triple backfield that they were deploying. It's a little bit more of a problem when it's week one. You kind of know what's coming. Gary Kubiak's offense isn't like this super complicated. It wasn't
right, and especially because it's an offense that you run yourself. Like you run the wide zone, outside zone. You should see this every day in practice. How are you having this hard of a time defending it?
Yeah. That reminds me of back in the day when Vic was here, and anytime the Falcons faced a mobile quarterback, they had no idea how to stop him, and it was like, you guys see this in practice every single day. How do you not have a clue how to do this? But yeah, it's Kubiak's not running like super complex things. He's not necessarily. It's just simple, power O, toss sweeps, stretch runs, just basic, for lack of it, basic. They work. Obviously, they're staples of any running game at all levels of football. But it is one of those things where it shouldn't be as hard as it is for the Falcons. And because it's week one, because, from a schematic standpoint, and, I haven't heard any direct quotes, but I heard rumors that, some players did say that they weren't necessarily prepared for this game like they would have been, or as much as they thought they would have been. And so it does raise some concerns about, the preparation of this football team and some of these issues that you continue to see, and what's going on. I know there are people out there that will put the blame on preseason and not playing enough and the losing and whatever. I kind of roll my eyes at that, but certainly there is some preparation issue that has plagued the Falcons too many times in some of their more recent losses. And this one, to me, is the most glaring one where it clearly looked like this team was not ready to play. And when you talk about things like that, the fingers do point at the head coach. And, particularly coming off of the heels of this offseason where they basically fired 3 coordinators and the defensive coordinator is now the head coach. And to see this, one of the things that people were hoping to see out of this defense under Dan Quinn was a much more disciplined unit, because that was, to me, it's not the talent, it's not the athleticism, it's not the speed that this defense lacks. It's really the discipline. It's guys doing their job. And we highlighted a couple of plays, and I'm sure you can go on Twitter, you can go to DJ Sockley film breakdown at AtlantaFalcons.com, and you can go in any number of places and highlight plays where guys are out of position, guys aren't executing their assignments, and that's a problem when we talk about the talent level of this team. And when guys can't get proper leverage, that's a problem. When guys are, completely oblivious to what's going on, what the offense is doing, that's a problem. And, the fingers have to point at Dan Quinn at this point.
And the in-game adjustments too. And that's why I was stressing that it's so important for them to get off to a fast start, not only in this week's game, but, typically, historically in the Dan Quinn era, if they don't get off to a fast start, they're not winning the ball game. I can't recall too many games where they came back from too many big deficits. And, again, it just speaks to the coaching as far as if something's going wrong, Dan Quinn struggles to fix it. I hate to bring up the Super Bowl, but when things were spiraling out of control like that, there was no change made. I mean, he just continued to roll his guys out, and it cost them the biggest game of his career. So, that's my biggest issue. And again, it's something that I've harped on for a while now. And I didn't think changing coordinators was going to fix it. Again, it does come down to the players doing their job, but the coaches have to be teaching them some of these details and putting them in the position to make some of these plays. And we haven't seen it, and we certainly didn't see it in week one. So again, this isn't to say that, because again, we've seen performances where they're on the money and they look great. And I'm expecting them to look much, much better this week. But in their losses, that's the common denominator is the lack of detail, the lack of execution, the mistakes. And again, we draw the comparison, I think, to this team to Seattle quite a bit because Dan Quinn's tried to replicate a lot of things that Pete Carroll did over there, and that was always something that Pete Carroll wasn't the best at either. At least from committing penalties standpoint, Seattle has always been kind of near the league lead in that. So again, that's not a great quality to bring over. Seattle was able to make do with that because they had the Legion of Boom and they had guys like Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill and Russell Wilson, but I don't know if they quite have that level of talent on the defense here in Atlanta to make up for it. But yeah, again, it continues to rear its ugly head, and that's the thing that I'm most concerned about moving forward. Is if Dan Quinn's going to keep his job, he's got to improve in that area as a coach.
I think we're going to learn a lot about this football team this week against Philadelphia.
And
how they respond to basically a shellacking at the hands of the Vikings. Because we talked about, their week one struggles, and the last couple of years they have not come out and looked good week one. They've won some of those games, but that Bears game they won, but they did not play well. The offense struggled, and if not for a couple of dropped Bears touchdowns in the final minute and a Brooks Reed sack, they should have lost that game. But then for the most part, they have come back week two and responded well and played well. And that's kind of going to be the expectation this week. But, you're not getting a Carolina team that you have historically, been able to beat. You're not getting an Oakland Raiders team from a couple of years ago. You're getting a Philadelphia Eagles team that the Falcons have, had their struggles against in terms of, and we talked about this with Michael Kist at the top of the show. It's not the Falcons haven't been competitive against Eagles. They've been absolutely competitive. But it just seems like they're not making the plays that they need to make in order to win those games. It seems to come down to whether it's a red zone. It comes down to not getting a turnover. It comes down to, Nick Foles heaving up whatever Nick Foles is doing and carving up the defense for a drive or whatever to put the Eagles in scoring position in a critical moment in that game. And you can't have that again this week, especially coming off of the heels of this Vikings game. So as Matt said, I think, getting off to a fast start is key for them. Being able to sort of dictate the pace of the game. They do not want to get behind against this Eagles pass rush. Like if you thought the Vikings pass rush was scary, and Mike talked about it, maybe this Eagles pass rush didn't perform up to expectations in week one, but I'm certainly sure that they're going to be, firing on all cylinders. Let's not test that theory about whether the Eagles pass rush is taking a step back or anything like that by getting behind in this game and allowing those guys to be able to pin their ears back, particularly now that we're down Chris Lindstrom, now that, Caleb McGarry's basically playing his, third NFL game. He's going up against Brandon Graham, Fletcher Cox, etc. So, the Falcons getting off to a fast start, being able to get some points early in the game, not turning the ball over and putting their defense in a bad spot where some of these issues get exposed will be sort of critical for them moving forward. So, Matt, what other sort of thoughts do you have on this week's matchup against the Eagles?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the offensive line. It does sound like McGarry's close to being physically capable of playing a full game, but I don't quite expect it this week. So again, I think we should still see somewhat of a rotation. In week one, they were doing McGarry for 2 series and then Sembrilo for 2 series. Maybe McGarry gets extended for 4 and then 2 and then 4 and then 2 or something. But I'll have my eyes on that matchup. In the nickel situation, it looked like, according to Pro Football Focus, Graham was moved inside. I'll be curious if maybe they leave him outside in this matchup just to go up against Caleb McGarry rather than go up against a more veteran presence in Jamon Brown. Although maybe they want to test the new starter there. So that matchup again, just like last week when it was Danielle Hunter versus McGarry and Sembrilo, Brandon Graham's in that same category, in that same tier. So that matchup is worth watching it and could determine the outcome. Another one, Isaiah Oliver, we talked about it a little bit with Michael Kist at the top of the show. Did not have a great debut against Thielen. It'll be interesting to see. I think, having a guy like Alshon Jeffrey, who's more of a underneath guy and not as shifty as Thielen or Diggs or even Deshaun Jackson is, I think that's a better matchup for him. So I'm curious to see if they pair those two up more often than not. I'm sure the Eagles will try to get that favorable matchup with Deshaun going up against Isaiah Oliver, which then brings me to my next point. As far as I think Ricardo Allen's presence is going to be huge in this game. Mike talked about it. That big play offense with Deshaun having 2 50-plus yard touchdowns, that was key in setting off that offense. Falcons historically, being that they run that cover 3 shell, they've been good at eliminating the big play, and Ricardo Allen's a big reason why. So I think he's going to have a huge impact on this game, keeping things in front of him, keeping things underneath. I'll live with that rather than the big play, because Uncle Mo is real in my opinion. So getting those big plays to guys like Deshaun Jackson, I think that's the big thing that the Falcons need to limit. And then lastly, also on the defensive side of the ball, how does the run defense do after allowing 172 yards this past week? The Eagles against the Redskins, it's a committee approach. Sproles had 47 yards, Jordan Howard had 44, and Sanders had 25. So they're going to come in bunches. They're going to come in waves. Falcons have to do a much better job. I do think the interior guys, Davison quietly with Grady Jarrett had a solid performance. I mean, anytime a nose tackle can lead the team in tackles, that's pretty impressive. And he won his matchups against Bradbury more often than not. So that looks to be a nice underrated signing, and he'll have a tough matchup going against a much better player, one of the best centers, arguably, if not the best, in Jason Kelce. So hopefully, he can keep up that effort, because, I do think they did a good job. It's just that the edge guys and the linebackers and the secondary, as we highlighted earlier on, need to do a much better job being in their gaps, being, playing assignment football, and, reading their keys and making the stops and containing them. Because again, this is a well-rounded Eagles offense. There's not one thing I think you can key on, but I think it's important to stop the run, as always, and then at that point make a team one-dimensional, and maybe you can get your pass rushers going a little bit. It was a limited sample size, but they did pressure Kirk Cousins on 5 of their 10 dropbacks. So we'll see if they can, carry that forward. They're playing, again, Eagles have the best offensive line in my mind. So it's not going to be easy, but I thought in the opener last year, I thought they did a good job of it, creating some pressure. Tack had a pretty nice performance against Jason Peters, and again, I think he's going to be playing pretty pissed off after his performance this past week. So hopefully he can parlay that into some pressures against Carson Wentz.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, piggybacking off of that with the Eagles' offensive line. Like, if they struggle stopping the run against the Vikings' offensive line, the Eagles have a much, much better offensive line than the Vikings do. And, one of the things that in one of the plays we highlighted was the Vikings were able to pull guys, and that's something that the Eagles have, a guy like Kelce in particular has made a career of being, great pulling on some of these plays and getting guys like Lane Johnson and Jason Peters out on the outside. So if the Falcons don't nip that in the bud, it's going to be another long day, even if you don't necessarily fear the Eagles running game to the same degree that you would the Vikings with Cook and whatnot. If they can't, play their gaps and do their assignments, it's going to be a lot more problematic against this Eagles offensive line that I would say, and I think most would agree with me, should do everything better than the Vikings possibly could do. And the last point, going back to sort of what you said with Ricardo Allen, I thought it was interesting, and maybe this was one of the things that, that the Falcons maybe have been a little bit taken aback by in terms of their preparation. The Vikings used a lot of tight ends. And one of the things that I noticed that they did was that they would often go with their 13 personnel, which is a 3 tight end look. And they would often split those guys out wide and use them as wide receivers. And it was effective pretty early in the game and throughout the game, both in the run game and in the passing game. And the Eagles sort of have, basically play 2 tight end sets or 3 wide receiver sets on like 98% of their plays, or at least that's what they were last year. And so you're going to see a lot more of Ertz. You're going to see a lot more of Goddard. And it goes back to what I just said about their offensive line being better than the Vikings. no offense to Kyle Rudolph and Irv Smith, who I think are a really solid tight end duo, but I think Ertz and Goddard are significantly better, and the Eagles will definitely, if the Falcons, allow it to be exploited to the same level that they did a week ago, that will be a much more problematic matchup for the Falcons. Now, the thing that you will like about the Falcons is last year, Devondre Campbell did a pretty solid job against Ertz in Keanu Neal's absence. Keanu Neal hasn't always had the best games against Zach Ertz, but prior to his injury last year and certainly in 2017, certainly had played some really outstanding football in terms of improving his coverage to lock down top end tight ends and whatnot. So I think the Falcons have the personnel to handle that matchup, but it goes back to what we talked about, with just being prepared that the Eagles are going to do a lot more, I think, exotic things with their offense from a schematic standpoint than the Vikings did, where the Vikings are just basically like, we're just going to pound it down your throat and we dare you to stop it. And they didn't stop it. And then the Eagles are going to throw some, schematic things on top of that. In addition to playing that way, which, we saw them lose to the Eagles that way in 2016. So it's one of those things where the Falcons are going to have to bounce back and fix it. And if they do fix it, obviously they'll have a great opportunity to win this football game. But the key is really seeing this team bounce back and immediately solve these issues that were problematic last week and be like, okay, this is not something that's going to linger. These, execution issues, discipline, the gap discipline, all those various things, the mental errors essentially that we saw and that Dalvin Cook run where we saw Casey sort of making that mental error. And in addition to all the other ones that the defense made, that has to stop. And if it does, then I think the Falcons will be in a good position to go toe to toe with this Eagles team. And as we've seen the last couple of outings, have an opportunity to sort of win the game in the end if the offense can, stay on track. All right. Any other thoughts on this Eagles game, Matt, before we jump into the mailbag?
No, just everyone that's going to the game, I'll actually be there. Just bring the juice because it's one of the few advantages I think we have over this Eagles team is the fact that it's going to be a home game. So I'm expecting it to be loud throughout. And yeah, let's get into some questions.
All right. Our first one comes from Matt Tate. Alshon Jeffrey, Nelson Aguilar, Deshaun Jackson, who are you putting on who? And are you doubling any of these receivers? Also, we know the Eagles are going to bracket Julio.
I think we touched on it briefly, but, Isaiah Oliver versus Alshon Jeffrey is the matchup I'd want. KZ on Aguilar. And then, you touched on it earlier. I think Deshaun Jackson versus Trufant, I think makes a lot of sense using Trufant's speed. Deshaun Jackson is the biggest X factor, the biggest concern of mine on this Eagles offense.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I guess there's a. Yeah, I'm not doubling any of them. They don't scare me as much. I mean, I don't. Obviously, Ricardo Allen being that deep defender, maybe you lean him towards Deshaun's side, but other than that, I think that's how I play it.
Yeah, the concern is going to be playing cover one man, and what cover one does in man coverage is it invites the deep shot, particularly for a guy like Deshaun Jackson. You see the counter of that with the Falcons, where anytime a team presents a cover one look, the Falcons usually dial up a deep shot to Julio. It's just go deep Julio or go deep Calvin Ridley, and we'll take our shot. And so the problem is that it's going to be hard to play any other coverage against the Eagles just because of their tight ends. And you're going to need, instead of playing cover two, you're going to need a guy like Neal up in the box to cover guys like Ertz and Goddard. So it does invite that challenge for the Falcons cornerbacks, and particularly for a deep threat like Deshaun Jackson, against lesser corners, as we saw a week ago, he can really take advantage of that. So Trufant does have quite a workout going for him in this matchup. So he's going to definitely have to continue to play well. I think he was one of the outstanding defenders for the Falcons in week one. Alongside guys like Grady Cherry and Deion Jones, I thought. So we're going to need another week from him like that. So yeah, that would be my sort of matchup. And, I wouldn't double any of those guys because I just think they have too many weapons to go around to really sort of say this one guy is the guy we have to take out.
Yeah.
They'll spread the ball around. Matt's next question is: who will be the lone man on Ridley, and will we see more production in Ridley and Sanu this game, or more Hooper?
Well, I guess Avante Max is their slot corner, I believe. So I mean, he's got the Sanu matchup. So then, Douglas, again, Michael Kist brought him up at the top of the show. Douglas being the long press corner could get assigned Julio. I know in the past. Well, I guess who was the guy on Julio in last year's matchup? It wasn't Darby. It wasn't Douglas. It was I don't even think he's on the team anymore. But I think again, it doesn't matter. I think Douglas could potentially be the Julio guy, and then Darby would be on Sanu. Ridley. Which again, Darby's their best corner. You oftentimes do see teams put their best corner on the second best target, and then bracket, with Douglas and a single high safety. So that could potentially be what we see. As far as who's going to see more production, Ridley Sanu, I mean that's anyone's best guess. It's hard to make that prediction. It does seem like this is a Julio game because once Julio, has a down outing, he usually bounces back with a big one, and he's 102 yards away from being the Falcons' all-time leading receiver. I think that the opening home game would be a great time for that to happen. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see 100 plus from Julio. As far as Hooper goes, Hooper, he was that garbage time guy this past week. We'll see if he gets into the action a little bit earlier. That could be a potential weak spot going up against the Eagles defense. If there's one spot that you want to say isn't as strong as the rest of the roster, it could be their linebackers. I mean, they have Nigel Bradham, who's a good player. Zach Brown came over from Washington, but we had seen him last year. He's nothing too special. I know Pro Football Focus liked him, but I don't quite see exactly what they see. And then they have Camus, Gruge, Hill, and Nate Gary as their other guys. This could be a prime opportunity for Hooper. Maybe he gets a touchdown in the red zone early on. But it's anyone's best guess. This is an offense that you never know from week to week who's going to be the focal point. But I do think, there's a good chance Julio has a big one just based on the fact that he had a slow start to start the year last week.
I'll be curious to see if the Eagles sort of employ the strategy. It was one of the strategies I talked about in the offseason is if I'm looking at this Falcons offense and I'm trying to match it up, this is how I would scheme it up. This is basically just borrowing the Bill Belichick Super Bowl game plan. This is the same game plan Belichick used earlier that season against AJ Green as well. And basically, if it was me, I would probably put like Rasul Douglas on Julio and have him just play press and give him safety help, and then put Darby on an island against Calvin Ridley, and then Jones or Maddox on Sanu, and then hope that Malcolm Jenkins can take care of
Hooper. Yeah, I forgot about that.
So that would be my strategy if I was the Eagles defensive coordinator, just because like Julio's going to get his, but I need to stop guys like Ridley and Sanu and Hooper from getting theirs. So I want to get better players, and they're going to be stuck on an island against those guys because Julio's drawing those double teams. And if I'm giving Douglas safety help, his speed, he obviously can't run with Julio, but if he can just jam him at the line of scrimmage and have a guy like Rodney McLeod sort of prevent, play over the top and prevent some of those deeper passes, then that should at least contain Julio Jones to a certain extent, and give some of those other guys a chance in one-on-ones. That's how I would play it. So we'll see if the Eagles, draw it up that way. I don't necessarily know if they're traditionally a shadow team. So I think generally speaking, they just kind of park their guys on one side of the field and let them go. So we'll just sort of have to see. So I think if that's the case, you're probably going to see more of Sidney Jones on Calvin Ridley, and more of Darby on Julio, and then Maddox at the nickel against Sanu. I know Maddox got hurt last week, so I think that's one of the reasons why Douglas wound up playing as much as he did. I don't know what Maddox's status is for week 2, but we'll find out later. So yeah, that would be my strategy. think we already answered the question about Cooks running outside. Okay, we got another one from Matt. I know the running game is going to be bottom tier. Do you see us utilizing Free and Ito with more swing passes to get their production going?
I'm not too sure what he means by the run game being bottom tier, but swing passes, I mean, screenplays that, we know how much Dirk Cutter loves a good screenplay. So it's possible. Again, I just think they got behind the sticks. They had to kind of tear up their game plan early on because the game was getting out of hand where we couldn't see them really feature the run game the way they want to. Hopefully that changes. And again, I wouldn't make too much of what we saw from Devontae Freeman. I don't expect that to continue moving forward. I mean, it was unfortunate he fumbled when he did. But again, I still think this run game, isn't going to be bottom tier like it was last season. But we'll see if they prove me right or wrong on that. Again, they're going to. The one thing I'm curious about them doing, because again, we talked about the two guards that they have and how Chris Lindstrom offered the ability to, as the athlete that he is, to climb the second level. And now that you have two, bigger guys in Jamon Brown and James Carpenter, not necessarily as athletic, do we see more inside zone? Because again, that's where Freeman has excelled before. I mean, he excels in the wide zone as well, but I think he can play the inside zone game, and I think Ito Smith, that's where he really thrives is the inside zone. So do we see more of that? Given that Chris Lindstrom's now no longer going to be playing the next at least 8 games, that's my big question mark as far as the change in production goes. But again, I don't think we can make too much of what happened in week 1 because the game got away from them and they kind of had to ditch their original plan.
Yeah, I know Matt's probably gonna get mad at me when I say this, but I think in week 1 we did get to see a little bit of a flash of sort of Ito's value in the passing game. I think he brings a little bit more to the table in terms of his quickness and bursts in the open field. There was a particular play on the swing pass where he was able to juke both Kendricks and another defender and sort of turn what should have been like a 5-yard gain into like a 10-yard gain. And so I really do think getting Ito, featuring him a little bit more in the passing game will be valuable in addition to, getting Freeman going in sort of the, traditional run game. So, I do think, I'm not necessarily agreeing with you on the statement of the running game being bottom tier, but I do want to see the Falcons get, both their running backs, but particularly Ito, a little bit more involved in the passing game. John Graham. Now, I know Matt's going to love this question. What is the cap penalty if we cut Devontae Freeman after the season? Will you guys support the move as Freeman, the bad one? Is he talking about me? I don't know.
I think he's talking about you, yeah.
Has been unavailable or trashed since his Super Bowl contract. Well, I didn't get a contract for the Super Bowl, so I don't think he's talking about me.
Yeah. So again, this is assuming because right now the Players Union and the NFL are trying to renegotiate the CBA because it expires in 2020. So assuming that they extend that, there's no lockout or anything, then post June 1 cuts are still available. And at that point, if they designated Devontae a post June 1 cut, it would be $3 million of dead money, and then it would be a $6.5 million savings next year. On the off chance there is no post June 1 cuts, then the $6 million that remains instead of just the $3, the $6 million would be a dead cap penalty, and they'd only save $3.5 million. So that's why I've been hesitant on saying it's a possibility, but I guess we should expect them to extend the CBA, and whether there's a lockout or not. I mean, it's eventually going to get done at some point. So post June 1 cuts are probably going to be a thing. So at that point, again, I'd say they'd save $6.5 million if they cut him next year. So I'll have an article coming out hopefully this weekend on a lot of these topics because they will have to make some decisions. And Devontae, again, I'm assuming him to have a bounce back week this week, a bounce back season, and it'll be a moot point when it's all said and done. But on the off chance he doesn't, then he could be a guy that's on the chopping block, and they roll with a committee approach or they draft another guy. which would make me so happy if they drafted another running back in 2020. But I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Well, whatever year is your worst nightmare, usually that's, at least my general rule with them, is that's what you expect for the Falcons to do. And they rarely disappoint you on that. So, I think the way the rule is that because 2020 is the last year of the salary cap, there is no post June 1 cut. So the only way that you could get a post June 1 cut on Freeman is if they extend the CBA before June of next year, which I think doesn't sound likely, but there's been various rumors and reports that
they're going to start back up this month, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, people say like, oh, a deal could get done sooner than people think. I'll believe it when I see it. I mean, just knowing how these things go. I thought the last negotiation we almost got, it didn't get done till July, and I feel like there's a lot more baggage for this negotiation than it was last time. But we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, just know whenever I do unveil this article, I am going to kind of list out both ways just to kind of show you, both angles, whether it makes sense to cut him with the post June 1 or without the post June 1, because again, what Aaron's saying is if they don't get the CBA negotiated by June, then you're looking at a $6 million dead cap hit for Davante. That's only $3.5 million of savings. It's probably not worth it then at that point. So all things to consider, all things that I am considering when I write this article. Again, hopefully this weekend it'll come out.
Yeah, and I think the point is, I think Matt brought it up, is like if you're only saving $3.5 million, that's not really a lot of savings. You're basically paying Davante $6 million to not play for you, and so like the only justification that you could have for eating that dead money is basically you're just like, well, he's not going to, like if he gets hurt again, like if he gets hurt next week and misses the rest of the season, at that point in time, you're like, well, we can't trust him to stay healthy. Might as well eat the money and use it elsewhere.
Yeah,
but like that's to me is like the only real scenario. Or like for whatever reason he's healthy, but it's terrible this season and has 512 yards rushing. It basically is like Steven Jackson in 2014 or something like that. On that level of just disappointment, or Michael Turner in 2012, where he just is a shell of himself. That would be the only way that I could see the Falcons being willing to eat that amount of dead money. So basically, the point I'm trying to make is if there is not a post June 1 cut that they can make, that's the only real reason I could see them cutting him. And I think, and instead, if it's just like, oh, we're paying him, we want to lower that cap hit, just restructure the deal and pay him the money that you think he's worth. And if he doesn't take that money, then you're justified in saying, okay, well, he doesn't want to renegotiate, and we can decide to cut him or for that. There's your sort of cause to cut him if that's the case.
Yeah, because I mean, you also have to consider replacement costs too. Because one of the things I'm toiling around with is Brian Hill. Again, it was a little bit of surprise seeing him inactive, and we'll see if that continues moving forward. But he's a restricted free agent. If they cut Freeman, do they want to give him a restricted free agent tag? Which again, if they did the original round tag, which is estimated around 2-point-something million. Combine that with Freeman's dead money of $6 million, you're looking at the same type of cap hit that you would have had if you just kept Davante. So those are all things to consider as far as, you let one player go, you're going to have to replace him somewhere on the roster. When you add those two numbers up, if it gets you to the same number that Davante's cap hit is, again, unless like what Aaron's saying, Davante Freeman had a terrible season, only 500 yards, there's not a whole lot of reason to cut that.
Yeah. So, to answer the second question, would I support the move? Like, I would have to see Davante really fall off a cliff the rest of the season for me to basically endorse the Falcons moving on from him. Khalil Murray asks, how often will we see Sanat inactive, and do you think not having him play against the Vikings had any effect on the poor run defense?
Yeah, I said this before the game last week on Twitter. I think it's going to be a regular occurrence. Two reasons: the special teams value. That's kind of why John Kaminsky was active over him. And then two, being that he's just a nose tackle, he doesn't really offer the positional flexibility of some of the other guys on D-line. Tyler Davison's locked in there. We talked about earlier. He had a good game. He was one of the impressive guys on the defense, the few that there were. So unless he's hurt, you're gonna likely see Sanat inactive every week. Which again, it's unfortunate because he's a 3rd-round pick. When he's been out there, he's been good. It's just for whatever reason the team decided to bring in Davison, liked him more. You can see a little bit why. I mean, he is a good player. How much more of an upgrade he is, how much more of an improvement is he in the pass rush department? I have my doubts there. I think Sanat showed in the preseason he can push the pocket and cause some pressures up the middle. Again, my question, and I'm looking far ahead, is, because I know that they like Davison to the point where they wanted to sign him to a multi-year deal. If they do that further blocks him for pretty much the length of his rookie contract, which again would be unfortunate. So we'll see. I guess he's got to continue to show it in practice that he deserves to be out there, and maybe in 2020 they don't re-sign Davison, because Davison could be in store for a Corey Peters type deal, which is 3 years, $12 million. You're likely not going to want to pay that for someone, for a nose tackle. And then as far as the effects, I think we went into it in the all 22 breakdown. It really wasn't the front three, the 3 down linemen. It was more the edge guys. It was more the linebackers. It was more the secondary that was at fault in the run D. It wasn't the guys up front. It wasn't Davison. It wasn't Grady. It really wasn't Alan Bailey. So no, I don't think it would have had any effect.
Yeah, unless you were going to get Sanat out there playing outside linebacker, which I think no one would think was a good idea.
Yeah,
I don't think it would have changed anything.
It'd be fun to watch though. But yeah,
yeah, I think he could do a decent job setting the edge against Kyle Rudolph. So maybe. But yeah, I think I've compared this in the past because I know people are going to like this comparison, but I think it's kind of similar to the dynamic between Davison and Sanat is kind of similar to the dynamic between Sanu and Hardy. Sanu is better, but I don't think by as much, and sort of like they're kind of occupying the same role. And so if you play one, you can't really play the other, or at least in the case of Sanu and Hardy, like the ideal role that Justin Hardy can play, because he played this in his rookie season, is really that slot receiver. And, if Sanu's going to play that role, then Hardy just kind of gets marginal. Like Hardy's not really an outside receiver. And that's been one of the reasons why he hasn't been as productive these last couple of years. And I think that's kind of the same situation with Davison and Sanat, where they're both nose tackles. They're both one techs. That's the ideal usage, but you can only really utilize one of those guys in your defense at a given time. And then even then, it's not that much of a usage because they're only playing base defense, which is 25 to 30% of the snaps. It was a little bit more this past week just because of how the Vikings played the Falcons. But it's just one of those things where you're not going to be able to really maximize both guys because they just have overlapping skill sets. And so I think the hope is with Sanat, you're just going to have to sort of bide your time with him. And he's there in the event that Davison gets nicked up or whatever, and you can have Sanat come in and not have much of a drop off at that position. And then Sanat's under contract for 2 more years after this season, so we'll have to sort of see how he develops and depend on whether Davison gets a long-term contract after this year when he hits free agency. But it's one of those things where I think right now Sanat is kind of like your stash for 2021 or 2022 at that nose tackle position, as opposed to a guy that's going to immediately impact right away. So I think people need to keep that in mind before they're like going too far on the Deidre Sanat's in the doghouse. The Falcons don't like him. They're all those sort of takes that we heard at the end of the summer. I just think really at this point in time, it's it's kind of a zero-sum game, so to speak. And right now, Sanat's kind of losing that game, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the Falcons are giving up on him, or at least I hope it doesn't mean that the Falcons are giving up on him.
And it's not a bad problem to have, having this kind of depth. I mean, it's depth that we really haven't had under Dan Quinn. And I'd be more disappointed again if we were paying Davison a boatload of money, but that's not really the case. I mean, he's on a vet min deal now. Again, like I alluded to, if they decide to extend him and give him a richer contract, then at that point, maybe it becomes more like you're saying, the Sanu Hardy dynamic, where you're overpaying for, marginal upgrade at that nose tackle spot. So we'll see what they end up doing. But I know the initial word was they like Davison enough to offer him a multi-year deal. So we'll see what they do.
You heard him. He said marginal upgrade for Sanu. So we're just going to move on to the next question. Someone take that soundbite. Khalil asked, based off of Oliver's mediocre performance going up against Thielen, how worried should we be about him going forward?
I guess let's see. Let's ask this question next week because again, much like the right tackle matchup going up against Daniil Hunter, I think we expected Oliver to take some lumps going up against, an All-Pro, Pro Bowl level receiver in Adam Thielen. It was a little interesting that they decided to put Trufant on the banged up Diggs and throw Oliver to the dogs like that. But again, the expectation is in the long run he's going to learn from this experience. Much like he learned. It was a good learning experience. That Cincinnati game I'm reminded of last year where, he kind of messed up in that zone coverage, giving up that game-winning touchdown. So all these lumps Oliver's taken, it's with the expectation that in the long run, when we get towards the stretch run of the season, he's going to be a better player for it. So I'd say hold off on asking this question until next week or maybe even a couple weeks just to see, again, he's a second-year guy, first-time starter. He's going to take his lumps. He's not going to be perfect right out the gate. And, I'd caution fans to say that he's the new Robert Alford because, again, I think that's way too early to rush to judgment like that.
Well, Robert Alford was the greatest cornerback ever. So, that's a compliment in my eyes. But, I think with Oliver, yeah, he did not have a great sort of starting debut. But, it's Adam Thielen. He's one of the 10 best wide receivers in the league. He's been consistently one of the top producers in the league. Now, I think putting him on Thielen was a smarter move than putting him on Diggs. Obviously we don't know sort of how serious the injury was for Diggs and whether that contributed, in addition to the fact that the Vikings didn't throw the football. But, one of the reasons why he wasn't as productive, was it because of the injury? Was it Trufant? Whatever the case may be. But I do think, I think we talked about this on last week's show, the Diggs-Oliver matchup was going to be one of the toughest matchups that Oliver potentially would have this season. And, so it made sense for the Falcons to put him on Thielen, but again, that's also a really tough matchup. And I think this Jeffrey game is going to be a good sort of litmus test, as Matt suggested, for what we can expect for Oliver moving forward, because this is a matchup that's more tailored to Oliver's skill set than Thielen is, even though Thielen is more tailored to Oliver's skill set than Diggs is. So it's kind of a spectrum. And, we're getting closer. I think Jeffrey is a good example. I don't know if Funch is out for the season.
I don't know if it's for the entire year. I think Reich said he can potentially come back, but he's definitely going to be out for the week 3 matchup.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Funches would have been a good matchup for Oliver as well. And then, Tennessee, Corey Davis is the big guy they have. And then
AJ Brown maybe too could be an interesting matchup.
Yeah.
He was the top guy.
Yeah. I don't know if they put Brown in the slot or not, like he was in college, but
something.
Yeah, and then then Houston would be probably Hopkins. So that's going to be another.
Yeah, let's not talk about that one right now.
Yeah, because I don't think you want Oliver on Will Fuller at all. That would be bad. I think he would.
Yeah, it's kind of like week 1 again, where it's going to be rough, and hopefully it's mitigated, and hopefully he'll have now some reps under his belt when he gets to that point. But yeah, that'll be a rough one.
Yeah, and that's a game, not to get too far ahead of us. That's a game where you're hoping the pass rush take care of business.
Yeah, true.
Can take advantage of that Texans offensive line and mitigate some of those issues that you're going to have potentially in the secondary against those receivers. So, I wouldn't be too concerned about Oliver right now, but obviously it's something to keep an eye on. Do you think?
Okay. Call them the Tweety Birds.
I was wondering if he was talking trash to the Falcons at first. I was like, wait, did I just do the wrong thing and put the he's calling the Eagles the Tweety Birds.
Yeah.
I think we can. I think we could beat the Falcons.
Yeah, I mean, as we've talked about, we've been competitive. It's not necessarily that they've had our number. There's just been some breaks here and there, and it goes back to the big talking point as far as the details and the execution. This game could be decided by a couple plays, and can the Falcons execute on those couple plays? That remains to be seen. As far as weaknesses go, it's tough to find some on this team. I know Mike talked about, one particular one, which was kind of surprising. I didn't think he'd go, and I was hoping he'd go to the defensive side of the ball. He went to the offensive side of the ball, and as far as how they were allocating their target shares, which again,
said they had too many weapons. That's
yeah, must be
basically what
nice, right? Must be nice. That sounds like a good problem to have.
yeah. We got
So
too many weapons. We just don't know how to distribute the ball correctly to all these weapons.
yeah, too much brain trust loss, and how are we gonna make up for it? But yeah, I mean, as I said, Aaron and I are bullish on the Eagles team. I think it's the best roster in football. So if they can come out with this win, this is an impressive win. It's not going to be easy. Again, I think they don't have a lot going for them, but the fact that it's at home, the fact they're coming off that shellacking in week 1, the expectation is they're going to be playing mad. And that's why I say, fans, get there early, be loud, stay in your seats throughout the game because, again, they're going to need it. Because this is bordering on must-win territory. There's a couple wins later, in the schedule that they can make up, I guess. But, teams that go 0-2, it's like a 12%, and maybe that's gone down recently. 12% chance of making the playoffs only, so it's not great odds. I guess someone threw out Matt Ryan's never gone 0-2 in his 11 seasons. So for this to be the first time, again, that would be interesting, and we'll see what the storylines are if that's the case. But try not to think about that now. I think they can win this game because again they've been competitive against this Eagles team. They play them well. It's just a matter of a couple plays executing on, and the hope is that at home, because the last couple have been in Philly, the hope is that home field advantage gives them the edge to execute on those plays.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is sort of how the NFL works. I think the Eagles are a better team than the Vikings, but I think the Eagles are a more favorable matchup for the Falcons.
Why do you say that?
I think the big issue with the Eagles is in the trenches, which is similar to the Vikings, but I think if the Falcons can handle that matchup, that battle, then I think they can exploit the Eagles' secondary a lot easier than they can exploit the Viking secondary. And I also don't think you have to worry as much about the Eagles running it down your throat like the Vikings did and controlling the game through their ground game. The Eagles are going to try to be a balanced offense and mix in a healthy dose of pass and run, but not necessarily be like the Vikings and be like, oh, we're only going to throw the ball 10 times. Obviously, situation kind of dictated that to a certain extent. But I do think there are more favorable matchups in the Falcons' favor that they can potentially exploit against this Eagles team than maybe there were against the Vikings, where it was basically just hope that your defensive line can beat their offensive line and hope that you can stop the run, and then hope that, for the first time ever, you've been able to score, more than a single touchdown against this Vikings defense, which is something the Falcons haven't done in 5 years. So I feel like this Eagles team is a little bit more favorable matchup. That's one of the reasons why I think these Eagles games have been a lot more competitive than some of these Vikings losses have been. I think the only reason that we consider some of these recent Vikings losses competitive is just because they're low scoring, because the Vikings aren't necessarily a team built to score 30 points a game or whatever the case may be. But it's been clearly one-sided, in my opinion, in terms of the Vikings taking care of business and completely dictating the game. And I feel like there's a little bit more back and forth between the Falcons and Eagles. Derek Hunter asks, why is Sanu still starting over and playing more snaps than Calvin Ridley?
He's a trusted veteran. I don't think it's by a huge margin. I didn't wait. I have the snap counts on my phone. I didn't think it was a huge margin. It really wasn't that noticeable of a margin last year, too. So Ridley got 61, Sanu got 66. I don't think it's worth quibbling over 5. Again, Sanu's all-around player. He's, again, the one knock on him is the explosiveness, I guess you can say. He's that volume underneath guy, move the chains guy, which again I think is important. It was important last week because they needed a guy like Sanu. Chris Spielman on the telecast made the point. I mean, they had to work for every yard that they got against that Minnesota Vikings defense, and a grinder like Sanu is important in games like that. We'll see if it's a little bit more spread out. I was going to ask you as far as, do the Eagles want to get in the shootout with this Falcons team? I think with Carson Wentz at the helm, they're more inclined to do that than they were the last two matchups when the Falcons saw Foles. But I am also curious if they take anything that they saw from the tape last weekend, because they can certainly play that style of game. I mean, with Jordan Howard, with Miles Sanders, even with Darren Sproles, they don't have an aversion to running him up the middle. They certainly didn't against the Redskins' talented front last week. So, we'll see, because, again, those low-scoring games never favor the Falcons. And if the Eagles can play to that type of game, do they want to do that, especially on the road? I think you want to try to limit the home team's possessions. But I guess going back to the question, Sanu starting again, he's a trusted veteran. They're paying him a good sum of money still. Again, the 3 wide receiver offense, I don't have the stat in front of me, but I mean that the 11 personnel 3 wide receiver was a huge majority of the offense this past week, and I think it will be moving forward under Cutter. It certainly was in his first day with Harry and Roddy and Julio. So, again, I think it was only a 5-snap difference. That's not really much to talk about. So you're still going to see Sanu out there just as much as you'll likely see Ridley out there.
Yeah. I think, against Minnesota, it doesn't, because you're not necessarily really the Vikings are so good at limiting big plays that it kind of is a little bit more tailored to a Sanu type of game. And we kind of saw that in the second half of the game where the Falcons kind of just basically just started dinking and dunking. And that was how they were able to sort of get their offense back in rhythm in the second half and start to move the ball. And then it ultimately led to some, sort of garbage time scores and whatnot. But, I think it kind of favors Sanu a little bit more just because, you're not going to necessarily get Ridley going. And like, one of the things I noticed watching the film earlier today was the Falcons wide receivers didn't really get open. And that's a problem, like even the Ridley touchdown, he wasn't really open. It was just Matt Ryan just threw it to a spot and really was able to get there, and Trey Waynes wasn't. So like I think this week, I do think, again, going back to what I just talked about, I do think this is a game where you can potentially, obviously, as the Redskins were able to do, attack this Eagles defense vertically. And so I do think, maybe this is more of a Calvin Ridley game than this past week was in terms of finding ways to get him going. And I think it's probably be a little bit more important for him to get going. So I think this week, you would like to see that flip and see Ridley get more opportunities. But again, 5 snaps is not that big a deal. I'm not going to necessarily be like the Falcons are doing it wrong because Sanu's playing 5 more snaps than Calvin Ridley. They're about getting equal. So slowly and surely, that will probably start to slant more towards Ridley the more he continues to play well. Lonnie Gums asks, what positions do you see the Falcons drafting in next year after the first game in the first 3 rounds?
I always like questions like this, thinking ahead, because I'm always thinking a year down the road. Right now, I think the top 3 position groups for me, and I'm not going to put them in any particular order. I'd go edge. Obviously, I think, with Vic Beasley's contract up, looking at where they stand in 2020, I think there's no way. I've seen people talk about there being a slight chance Beasley's back. I don't see it. So they're going to have to replace that spot. Inside linebacker or linebacker in general is one that I have. Again, with Devondre Campbell being a free agent, I think there's a chance they can bring him back. You'll see that in the article. But I'd put that more likely that he's gone.
It depends on price, right? It's all about price.
Yeah. I mean, the contract that I have in mind, I think they could fit it under. But they really have to get aggressive, I think, as far as, the restructures and the cuts. And I tend to err on the side of caution because we haven't seen Dimitroff get too aggressive for me to think he's going to change. But and then thirdly, I think, interior offensive line still, specifically someone that has, center capabilities, because they do have to start thinking about the future there. And there's a couple good options. Tyler Biadasz is one that I've, had circled for a while. I don't know how high he's going to go and whether the Falcons will be picking high enough to select him. Creed Humphrey's another one from Oklahoma, and then Jake Hansen's maybe someone on day 2 from Oregon. So those are the 3 right now that I think could be the Falcons' first 3 picks. But again, a lot's going to change from here and now, so we'll see. We'll have to go back on the show and see if there's still going to be the same positions a couple months from now.
Yeah, for me, edge I think is up there. I have long thought that there was 0 chance that they would keep Beasley, but like now I think there's like a 8% chance that they'll keep Beasley. So it's gone up. I still think it's unlikely, but we'll have to sort of see what the rest of the season says.
It's got to be a cheap contract. I just, and again, what's the cheapest off the top of your head that you can think of edge contract these days? Because, it's getting up there to the point where you're at least almost 8-9 million. I mean,
Yeah.
Cameron Wake got 7.5 million. He's 36, 37.
More like 46, 47, but yeah.
Still doing it, man. Still doing it, though.
Yeah.
Got his 100th sack this past
someone
week.
needs to take his blood and
harvest
it'll
it.
probably cure cancer or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think edge is likely. That would probably be the top defensive need, I think, at least as far as like early draft picks go.
Mm-hmm.
I think everything else is more a depth position. I do think there's a good chance that they'll keep Campbell. I think it's probably closer to 50% right now than probably a lot of people think. I think a lot of people see it as a long shot. I don't think it is a long shot. I think right now it's probably a coin flip, and we'll sort of have to see if Campbell plays better the rest of the year, and that will make it creep that number up. But for me, I think offense is going to be a quiet need for the Falcons early in the draft because I'm with you. I think centers, the Falcons are going to, whether Alex Mack retires or sticks around, I think the Falcons are going to kind of do what they did with Joe Hawley several years back with Todd McClure with an eye towards the future. Like, okay, this is our Alex Mack replacement whenever we need it. And whether that's 2020 or 2022 or whenever that is, they're going to want to get that guy in-house as soon as possible so they have a contingency plan. So I think, and because of how good a center Alex Mack is, that's not necessarily more than likely you're not going to be able to find that guy in round 5, round 6 that can sort of fill those shoes like that. So I think you'll probably see, similar to what we saw with the Saints taking who's the guy from Texas A&M,
Eric McCoy.
Yeah, someone in that sort of day 2 range, and the guys that Matt mentioned, I think are good candidates sitting here today, projecting, 8 months or whenever it is from now. But and then the other position I think is wide receiver. I think we'll have to sort of see what Sanu does the rest of the season, but I think without a really strong year, I do think the Falcons will probably shake up their wide receiver depth, and that'll be a way that they can create some cap space next year. And particularly if Ridley takes a big step up, I think the Falcons will probably say, okay, let's try to get a sort of a number 3 guy that can be, that can join Ridley and Julio and engage and sort of fill that Sanu role potentially as an outside guy, because I do kind of think sitting here today, I think the Falcons will probably try to use Ridley as sort of their inside-outside guy in the future in the post-Sanu world. So I think, getting another sort of outside threat at the wide receiver position could be, it's like a 3rd round sort of pick.
Yeah, I think that's why this week, if Gage can't go, is important for a guy like Zaccheaus. He's likely going to be up if Gage is out, just to see, because you got to evaluate some of these guys on the bottom of the depth chart to see, like you said, if Zaccheaus shows some stuff. I mean, the way I'm thinking is, you have Gage, you have Zaccheaus, and perhaps, I think part of the reason you keep Hardy is to, again, give yourself an insurance policy, kind of hide him a little bit from the market so that, again, maybe you can turn around and give him another vet min or maybe slightly above vet min contract to mitigate Sanu's loss and not make wide receivers such a need going into 2020. Because if you have Hardy, Gage, and Zaccheaus, I don't necessarily know if you need to spend, a premium top 3 pick on a receiver. Again, I could certainly see it just because of the stuff you've said, but I would hope that they would kind of go away from that a little bit, because again, if Calvin Ridley continues to take that next step, you have Julio and Calvin kind of shouldering the load. I don't necessarily know if you need a third guy. But again, just like with running back, they've done some crazy things, and I wouldn't be shocked if they continue to, invest in that offense, since that's how they've typically gone the last couple of years.
Well, I mean, it goes back to what you said about sort of using those 3 wide receiver sets. If that's going to be sort of their bread and butter of their offense, if you want to keep that going after Sanu, I mean, and we talked about this leading up to last year's draft, where it's like, are you going to be a 3 wide receiver based offense? Or are you going to be a 2 tight end based
Right.
offense? You need to kind of decide, like, what is,
you don't think Gage and Hardy? I mean, you've long said that, Hardy can play that role that Sanu's played, and I think one of the positive takeaways from this past week's game was Gage showed he can contribute and play at this level. I think it's unfortunate he got knocked out, and hopefully he just misses one game if he does. But I think Gage and Hardy have shown enough to potentially split those reps in those 3 wide receiver sets.
That's fair. I am of the opinion, you know how people always say, like, you should always draft a running back or whatever. Or at least people used to say that. I don't know if they say that quite as much now.
Yeah, I don't think they're saying that anymore.
But like, I kind of believe that you kind of always need to have like a wide receiver pipeline. You always need to go out and get playmakers in your passing game. And I've seen, in my opinion, I think partially to blame the 2013, 2014, and 2015 seasons not quite living up to expectations was in part because the Falcons, kind of were complacent with their wide receiver depth for a number of years. And I feel like, like, I like Hardy, I like Zacchaeus, I like Gage, but I would also love to have a Mecole Hardman. I would love to have a Michael Gallup. I would love to have, those guys in addition to that.
Yeah.
And always keep, the next guy going, and always having more weapons for Matt Ryan to throw to. So
yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of it's contingent too. I mean, you think Campbell has a better chance of coming back than I do. So if that's the case, then that crosses off my linebacker prediction that I'm speculating here. So again, a lot of this has to be determined by who they keep and who they let go. So if they keep Campbell, then yeah, I think wide receiver maybe jumps up. I had tight end on my list in the top 5 because again, I still want them to get to that 12 personnel, 2 tight end looks. I thought we had a great chance at it this past off season, and they.
And then Daniil Hunter blew up Luke Stocker.
Blew up their tight end too that they made a point to get. So see how that worked out. But there's not. I don't think this tight end class, based on the early looks, is as deep as last year's was. There's a couple guys, Mitchell Wilcox, Alberto from Missouri, but they probably missed that chance last year. But again, we'll see. A long way to go to determine that, and it boils down to who they keep and who they let go. But yeah, I wouldn't be shocked if wide receiver. I just don't think. I think you have a couple guys on the rise, and I'm not totally giving up on Christian Blake as far as maybe being the wide receiver 6 contributor, being that Sanu clone or poor man Sanu. But again, we'll see what they do. They tend to lean offense in the draft, so it wouldn't shock me.
Lanny asks, how do you feel about Dan Quinn's job security after the first game?
Less confident, for sure. We had talked about this. I really do think this is a make or break season. If they're not in the playoffs, I do think he's gone. That's been my take all along. And again, like you said, we're gonna learn a lot about this team this week, what they're made of. Quinn talks about it a lot. I mean, iron sharpens iron, and the metal of this team and the guys that they have, what they're made of. We're gonna see it because this is must-win territory. They got their butts whooped against the Vikings in Week 1, and now they're in prime time going up against one of the NFC favorites. We'll see what they've done to correct their mistakes and to make right by it. Because again, he's put it all on him this year, taking on the defensive coordinator reins, and that was not a good foot forward for him in that role against the Vikings. They were simply outcoached and just did not execute. We're not on the details. Kind of just sleptwalk through that game.
Yeah. Look, my opinion of Dan Quinn, if I'm Arthur Blank, and if I'm in Arthur Blank's shoes, I'm good on Dan Quinn so far. Like, obviously I reserve the right to change my opinion as more of the season unfolds. But I'm kind of good on sort of Dan Quinn being on a pretty cool seat. But I think if I'm, that's Aaron Freeman as the owner of the Atlanta Falcons. But if I'm sort of putting myself in Arthur Blank's shoes, I think you're right. I think, it's hard for me to imagine Arthur Blank sort of being good with this team having a losing season. I think you can miss the playoffs and go 9-7 and lose on a tiebreaker or something like that and still keep the job. But I think 7-9 is going to be very unlikely that he keeps his job unless there's like a major series of injuries that they can sort of point the finger at, even more so than we saw last year. 8-8, I think, is teetering on the edge, but it's still, I wouldn't necessarily, knowing Arthur Blank's history, I think he sees 8-8.
Yeah, I mean, you could just point to the Jim Moore era. I think it's kind of a similar situation, and then he cut him after that. So
so I think the Falcons, obviously don't want to overreact to week one, as we've talked about. They generally do not play well in week one and then usually bounce back in week two. But certainly, I do think as far as bad week one performances go, this was the worst one. So it's a little bit more concerning than maybe it has been in some of the previous seasons. Lanny asked, should the Falcons bring in Jordan Willis for a visit?
I didn't really like him as a prospect too much. I thought he was fool's gold a little bit with that combine performance. It never really showed up on tape. Watching him, I know there's a need at edge rusher. I had thought maybe they weren't going to bring in an offensive lineman this week with Lindstrom going down. I thought maybe they'd take a chance on a vested veteran for an edge rusher depth. They opted not to do that. So I'd rather pick someone else. There's not a lot of names out. I threw out Nick Perry. It's not really an inspiring choice, but someone that they've looked into in the past, has had a couple successful seasons prior to his injury. So I'd rather bring him in than Jordan Willis.
Yeah, I had the same thoughts on Jordan Willis. I wasn't a huge fan of him in the draft. And that was the Tack, Derek Rivers, TJ Watt sort of class, Carl Lawson as well. And there was a lot of other guys that I had ahead of him. So he wound up getting drafted about where I thought he deserved to go. I know there was a lot of talk after that combine that he was sort of potentially a late first round sort of guy in the Falcons range there. He hasn't quite necessarily lived up to that sort of post combine hype. He's been okay as a rotational player, but obviously the Bengals decided to cut him, and they've done a lot to draft a lot of young defensive linemen. I'm sure the Bengals have basically had the strategy the last couple of drafts that I know Matt and several other Falcon fans wish the Falcons would have had. Just constant pipeline of the Sam Hubbards and the Andrew Billings and the Carl Lawsons, et cetera, to sort of keep that area of their defensive line of strength for their defense. And that's a conversation that I'm sure we will be having plenty of those this offseason. But I think basically I brought that up just to say that Willis has kind of been lost in the shuffle. But basically the short answer for this question is, like, at this point, beggars can't be choosers. And so even though I'm not a huge Jordan Willis fan, I think we saw kind of on Sunday, like, the thinness of the depth at the edge be very problematic for the Falcons when Tack went out, and we saw Claiborne struggle on that, setting that edge. That's not really what, you re-sign Adrian Claiborne to basically have him be an outside linebacker. Like, I really hope that's not the plan. That's a bad plan if that's the plan. Like, that's kind of the worst way to use Adrian Claiborne. So at this point in time, like, anybody at the edge rusher group, like, I look at Nick Perry and I'm like, he hasn't been healthy in like 4 years. But at the same time, as I said, beggars can't be choosers. So really at this point, anybody at edge rusher I would take at this point in time just to get some depth there. And you're right. And instead of keeping a guy like Wetzel, I would just sort of roll with 8 offensive linemen on the roster and get another edge guy, because I think that was a problem on week one. And if you have if Tack misses more than a series, or
Yeah.
Vic Beasley misses a series or a game or whatever, and those injuries become a bigger issue, I think it's going to go right back to being a major issue.
Did you notice Campbell at all in your rewatch on the edge? Because that was something I had speculated they'd use him a little bit more there, and I don't think I saw it much.
I didn't, but I didn't. I kind of skimmed over the defense on watching the
Yeah, I don't blame
All-22, and I kind of just erased that from my mind.
Yeah, it was bad. No need to go back to it, right?
Yeah, so that'll be something I'll check when I really go down and take.
I mean, he played 100% of the snaps, but I don't recall too many times where he was really on the edge. I'm sure there was a few, but I expected a little bit more, and to balance the thinness out, which again, we saw what happens if Tack or Vic go out. You got Adrian Claiborne there, and that's about it. And he's playing out of position even at that point. So, yeah, that's why we've said for a while now they need another edge. They have Austin Larkin sitting on the practice squad. Do they think he's a 53-man caliber player? Maybe we see it soon if we continue to get the same level of performances out of the edges. But yeah, I guess you're right. Beggars can't be choosers at this point. We need some bodies there.
Yeah. Let's see. We have one last question. All right. G.A. Red Clay asked, did it seem we were just trying too hard and never settled down until it was too late?
I would say Matt Ryan was definitely pressing a little bit. I mean, I think you saw that from his first interception, and you can even say you saw it in that second interception. Trying to make the big play when it wasn't there. He didn't get settled in until later in the game. So, I don't know if the team as a whole you could say that for, but I definitely noticed it with Matt Ryan. He was not settled in until the game was kind of out of reach. And, I don't blame him if the first play had a lot to do with it. The fact, first play, sack, untouched, that could rattle a cage and definitely throughout your script and whatnot. So, yeah, I would say it for him, but for the team as a whole, again, they just looked like they didn't come to play. It wasn't like they were trying too hard or doing too much out there. Maybe Tack, you could say at one point, trying to do too much in the run game, trying to take some chances where he should have just, again, played assignment football. But, yeah, for the most part, again, they just didn't come to play.
Yeah, I mean, there's a history of when you can hit Matt Ryan early in a game, it'll throw off his timing.
Yeah.
And he'll start to press a little bit. And I think that was this game was a clear example of that. He just really seemed out of rhythm the entire game and was making some very questionable decisions. And, at times, because he made some poor decisions and threw some picks, then there were other times where he was a little hesitant to pull the trigger because he didn't want to turn the ball over. And it was just kind of all over the place. And it really didn't get settled on offense until the second half, as I mentioned earlier, where they kind of just went to sort of a dink and dunk offense, get the ball out quick, run some stat concepts and some quick outs and whatnot, and we'll just sort of matriculate the ball down the field 5-6 yards at a time in the passing game. And that's why Austin Hooper had such a big, boost in production, because there was just a lot of dink and dunk stuff to him in the second half. And I think, the case you can make, and it's often been the case with the Falcons, is this team kind of goes where the offense goes. If the offense comes out strong, the defense sort of follows. If the offense gets off to a slow start, then the defense kind of just crumbles a little bit. And so if you do want to apply it to the team because the offense, didn't settle down until the second half, the defense didn't really settle down. We didn't see the run defense pick up until the second half of the game. And then how much of that is made to adjustments? How much of that is just simply knowing that the Vikings were just trying to run out the clock and you knew exactly what they were trying to do? That's a matter of debate and whatnot. So I do think you can make that case that the Falcons came out a little antsy for whatever reasons. I endlessly speculate what the cause of that was. Lack of preparation. Maybe someone was in the hotel room the night before, keeping them up late at night. I have no idea. It could be in any number of variables that we don't know. But yeah, it did seem like the Falcons were a little antsy, and then it took them, 3 quarters to really sort of settle down. And by then it was way too late.
Yeah.
All right, guys, another 2-hour show in the books.
Yeah, it was at like the 115 mark, and then we did these questions and we go off on debates. But again, we appreciate you guys, coming in the chat and asking them. Hopefully, you like this new format. I think we're going to keep it up, and then as Aaron said a couple weeks ago, we're going to try something, another new feature in a couple weeks where we bring one or two or three of you guys on, kind of like a radio style, call in format where you can come in, chat with us, ask questions, and either stay on the air or you can take the questions off the air. So again, a lot of exciting new things we're trying out here. Hopefully, you guys enjoy it, and make sure you're leaving some comments and giving us some feedback on what you like or what you dislike.
Yeah. So definitely you guys want to subscribe to the Pro Football Central YouTube channel. Hit that bell icon so you know when we go live so that you guys can be in here for the chat. I know for some of you guys that usually send in your mailbag questions via Twitter, and I know some of you guys don't necessarily watch the show live and listen to the audio version. We apologize, for not answering those questions. If you guys do send those questions in, we will try to make an effort to answer those questions at some point, but we do like sort of the more interactive live feature with the chat. So we're not ignoring you, but it is, we're sort of tailoring to the live audience a little bit more at this point in time. And, check out profootballcentral.com if you want to check out the audio version and find the links to the show on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and other various podcast platforms. You can find us there. Of course, you want to follow us on Twitter. You can see our Twitter handles right below us for the video. I'm at FalcFans. Matt is at Matt Karoly. For you audio folks, we want to thank Michael Kist for joining us for this 2-hour extravaganza, even though he ducked out pretty early. But go check out Mike's stuff. Matt's right. If you are into draft stuff, he does a lot of great draft coverage, and he's a good year-round follow, not just for Eagles stuff. So check him out. Michael Kist NFL on Twitter, and check us out on Facebook, Falcon Central Radio. There, I know we don't necessarily do as much interaction, but we're going to try to pick that up in the coming weeks. So if you guys have questions and comments, you can still hit us up on the Facebook page as well. Any other last thoughts, Matt, before we duck out?
No, as I mentioned, I'll be there at the game in Atlanta. So if any of you guys want to kind of hit me up on Twitter, maybe meet up, talk a little bit Falcons football in person, that'd be cool. And then, as I mentioned, hopefully I have an article out this weekend, riseupreader.com, kind of going through and looking at the 2020 cap outlook for the Falcons and what decisions they're going to have to make to keep this thing going.
Yeah. So there you have it, guys. Appreciate everybody for joining us tonight, and we'll see you guys next week to talk about this Eagles game and then the Jacoby Brissett and the Indianapolis Colts.